I want to talk to you tonight about a mistake I have watched destroy more good intentions than almost any other single mistake I've studied in 40 years of watching people try to build something with their lives. It's not laziness. It's not lack of talent. It's the simple, almost innocent-looking habit of announcing the plan before you've built anything to show for it. I call tonight's message build in private, flex in public, and I want to explain to you exactly why that order matters, why reversing it quietly sabotages people who would otherwise have succeeded, and what it actually looks like when somebody finally gets the sequence right. Here's the pattern I want you to recognize, because I suspect some of you are going to recognize it in your own life before I even finish describing it. Somebody decides to build something, a business, a body, a skill, a book, and the very first thing they do, often within days of the decision, is tell everybody. The social media post announcing the new business. The gym check-in tagged with a transformation hashtag before a single pound has actually come off. The declaration at Thanksgiving dinner about the novel they're finally going to write this year. And here's what almost nobody realizes in that moment, standing there feeling the warm rush of everybody's encouragement and congratulations. That moment of public announcement feels like progress. It is not progress. It is, in a very real and measurable psychological sense, often a substitute for progress, and the substitute can be so satisfying that it quietly replaces the actual work. Let me explain the mechanism, because once you understand it, you will never look at a public announcement the same way again. Researchers who study goal pursuit have found something that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. When people announce a goal publicly and receive positive social feedback, the likes, the congratulations, the encouraging comments, their brain registers a small hit of satisfaction, almost as if the goal itself had been partially achieved. The identity of person who is building this thing gets partially confirmed by the social response, before a single hour of actual work has been logged. And because the mind has already received a taste of the reward it was originally after, the motivation to do the actual, harder, unglamorous work of achieving the goal measurably decreases. This isn't a character flaw unique to weak-willed people. It's been observed across all kinds of people pursuing all kinds of goals. The applause, taken too early, quietly steals fuel from the very engine it was supposed to be encouraging. Let me put some real numbers on this, because I want you to see exactly what this costs over time. Say you have an idea worth building, call it, for the sake of the math, a project that would take 500 hours to complete if you worked on it consistently. Research on goal announcements suggests that people who announce a goal publicly before doing meaningful work on it are measurably less likely to see it through to completion than people who quietly build first and mention it only once real progress exists. We are not talking about a small effect. In study after study on this exact phenomenon, the completion gap between announced early and announced late groups runs into double digits in percentage terms. If even a 20% higher failure rate applies to everyone who announces first, and you multiply that across every meaningful goal a person attempts over a lifetime, and most people attempt dozens of significant goals across their adult years, the arithmetic gets brutal quickly. A person who consistently announces early might complete, say, 4 out of every 10 serious attempts they make over the years. A person who consistently builds first and speaks last might complete 6 or 7 out of that same 10. Over a lifetime of ambitions, that difference in completion rate is the entire difference between a person known for talking about big plans and a person known for quietly having built several genuinely impressive things. Let me tell you about a woman I'll call Priya, though I've changed her name because the lesson matters more than she does. Priya worked in hospital administration, and for years she'd talked, quite openly and often, about wanting to write and publish a novel, something she'd been telling friends and family about since her mid-20s. Every year around the holidays, somebody would ask, "So, how's the book coming?" And every year Priya had some version of the same answer. She'd started it, she had a great outline, she was really going to focus on it this year. She told me later that she genuinely believed, every single time she said it, that she meant it completely. I met Priya at a professional development conference for healthcare administrators, and during a break she told me about the novel, mostly, I think, out of habit, the way people repeat a story about themselves so many times it becomes almost automatic. I asked her one question I ask a lot of people in her exact position. I said, "Priya, in the years you've been telling people about this book, how many of those conversations happened before you'd actually written 5,000 words of it?" She thought about it honestly, which I respected, and said, "Jim, if I'm being truthful, probably every single one of them. I've been talking about this book for nearly a decade and I don't think I've ever had more than a few thousand words actually written at any point." I told Priya something that surprised her, because it wasn't the writing advice she expected. I told her, "Priya, I don't think your problem is discipline, and I don't think it's talent. I think you've been getting a real, measurable dose of satisfaction from talking about the book for 10 years, and that satisfaction has been quietly standing in for the satisfaction you'd get from actually finishing it, without you ever noticing the substitution happening." I gave her one instruction, and I asked her to follow it exactly, uncomfortable as it would feel. For the next year, I told her, don't tell a single new person about this book. Not a word, to anyone who doesn't already know. Write in complete silence, and only speak about it again once you have something real and finished to show. A completed draft, not an idea, not an outline, an actual manuscript. Priya told me later that the first few months of silence were strange in a way she hadn't anticipated. She'd catch herself, at a dinner party, about to mention the book the way she always had, and stop herself mid-sentence, and the discomfort of that unspoken sentence, she said, was almost worse than any writing session itself. But something else happened alongside that discomfort, something she hadn't expected at all. Without the regular release valve of talking about the project, the actual pressure to write it started building somewhere else entirely, inside her, instead of in the applause of a conversation. She told me the silence made the unwritten book feel unfinished in a way that talking about it for 10 years never had, because talking about it had always given her just enough of a feeling of progress to relieve the pressure without ever requiring the actual work. 11 months into that silence, Priya finished her first complete draft. Not a good draft, she told me, laughing about it later, genuinely rough in places, but complete, 500 pages of an actual story with a beginning, middle, and end. The first time in nearly a decade of talking about this exact project that anything resembling a finished manuscript had existed. She spent another 8 months revising it in that same quiet, and when she finally did tell people, not with an announcement of a plan, but with an actual finished manuscript she was submitting to agents, the response, she said, was entirely different from the encouraging but ultimately hollow support she'd gotten for a decade of talking about an idea. People were, in her words, genuinely stunned, because as far as almost everyone in her life knew, this had simply been a thing Priya talked about, the way people talk about things they never actually do. Nobody had any idea real, silent progress had been happening at all, and that shock, that genuine surprise at the actual finished thing, was worth infinitely more to her than a decade of premature congratulations had ever been. I want you to sit with what happened to Priya, because it's the whole lesson wrapped into one story. The decade of talking hadn't been neutral. It had been actively working against her, quietly siphoning off just enough satisfaction, conversation after conversation, that the actual writing never felt urgent enough to prioritize over everything else competing for her time. The silence wasn't a punishment or a sacrifice for its own sake. It was the removal of a false reward that had been standing in for the real one for 10 straight years, and the moment that false reward was removed, the real pressure to actually build something finally had room to do its job. Let me address an objection I know some of you are already forming, because I hear it nearly every time I give this particular talk. You're thinking, Jim, isn't it good to have accountability, to tell people so they can check in on you and keep you honest? And that's a fair point, but I want you to notice the distinction I made a moment ago, because it's the entire hinge this whole idea turns on. There's a real difference between telling a small handful of people who will genuinely hold you to specific, uncomfortable questions, and posting a general announcement to a wide, casual audience whose only real function is to congratulate you for having an idea. Priya's mistake was never telling people at all. It was telling everyone, casually, in a way that generated warm feelings without generating a single hard question. A real accountability partner asks you, 3 weeks later, exactly how many pages you've actually written, and doesn't let you off with a vague answer. A wide public announcement almost never asks you anything at all, because the social contract of a casual congratulations doesn't include follow-up. If you want real accountability, choose 1 or 2 people specifically for their willingness to ask uncomfortable, specific questions, and give the rest of your circle nothing to react to until you have something finished to show them. So let's talk about what build in private, flex in public actually looks like for you, starting with whatever goal you're currently carrying that you've already told several people about, half-finished, the way Priya had told people about her book for a decade. First, I want you to identify the exact moment you're tempted to announce progress rather than results, because that's the precise moment this pattern usually strikes. The urge to post about starting the diet instead of posting the actual transformation. The urge to tell coworkers about the side business idea instead of showing them the first sale. Notice the urge, and understand that in that exact moment, you are being offered a small, cheap substitute for the much larger reward waiting on the other side of actual completion. Second, set a real, tangible threshold for when you're actually allowed to speak about the project publicly, the way I gave Priya a completed manuscript as a threshold rather than an ongoing idea. Not when it feels ready to share. A specific, objective marker, the finished draft, the first paying customer, the first £10 actually lost and kept off for a month, something concrete enough that you cannot talk yourself into an early announcement by convincing yourself the moment has arrived when it hasn't. Third, understand that the silence is not secrecy for its own sake, and it's not about hiding your ambitions from people who care about you out of shame. It is a deliberate removal of a false reward, so that the actual reward, the finished thing, retains its full pulling power over your motivation instead of being partially satisfied in advance by applause for an idea. You are allowed to tell your closest few people, the ones who will actually hold you accountable rather than simply congratulate you. What you're avoiding is the wide, casual, low-stakes announcement that gives you all the social reward and asks nothing of you in return. Fourth, and this is the step that makes the whole formula actually live up to its name, once you cross that real threshold, flex without apology. This isn't a philosophy of permanent humility or hiding your accomplishments forever. Quite the opposite. Once Priya had an actual finished manuscript, she had every right to talk about it, and she did, and the impact of that conversation, landing on real, undeniable proof instead of an idea, was dramatically larger than a decade of premature announcements had ever produced. Build in private isn't an argument against ever being public about your success. It's an argument for sequencing the two correctly, so that when you do finally speak, you're speaking from a position that actually earns the attention instead of borrowing against a reward you haven't built yet. Here's something else worth noticing about this whole approach. Nobody around you can see the difference between silent, genuine progress and silent, genuine stagnation from the outside, and that's exactly why the private building phase feels so uncomfortable to almost everyone who tries it for the first time. There's no applause during the actual work. There's no encouraging comment section while the 500 pages are slowly getting written. The entire reward, for the length of the private phase, has to come from inside you, from the simple, quiet satisfaction of watching the real thing take shape, and for people who've spent years running on the fuel of public encouragement instead, that internal fuel source can feel, at first, alarmingly thin. It isn't thin. It's just unfamiliar, because almost nobody has ever asked it to carry the full weight of a project before. And understand the compounding on this the same way you'd understand compounding on anything else in this series I've given you. Priya's decade of premature talking hadn't just failed to produce a book. It had actively trained her own mind to associate the idea of the book with a reward already partially received, which is precisely why the motivation to finish it kept quietly draining away year after year. The silent year reversed that entire training. It reattached the reward to the actual finished thing, where it belonged the whole time, and once that reattachment happened, the book that had sat unfinished for a decade got completed in less than a year. Priya told me she now applies this same rule to almost everything she takes on, well beyond writing, a new certification she's pursuing at the hospital, a fitness goal she's working toward, even a home renovation she and her husband decided to tackle themselves. In every case, she said, the pattern holds. The quieter she keeps the early stages, the more real pressure ends up going directly into the work instead of leaking out through 100 small conversations that felt like progress but never actually were. So here's what I want you to do, starting with whatever half-finished, much talked about goal is sitting in your own life right now. Identify the real, objective threshold that will mark actual completion, not a feeling of readiness. Stop announcing progress to anyone outside a small circle who will actually hold you to it, starting today, even if you've already told a dozen people about the plan. Build in genuine silence until you cross that threshold. And when you cross it, flex without apology, because you will have finally earned the exact reward you've been quietly trying to borrow against for years. Most of you are not going to do this. I've given this talk enough times to know exactly how it plays out. Most people will hear this tonight, agree with every word of it, and then next week, feeling a fresh burst of motivation about some project, will post about starting it before they've done a single hour of real work, because the applause feels so good in the moment, and the moment always wins over the distant, uncertain reward of actual completion. That's their choice, and I understand the pull of it, because the applause is real and immediate and the finish thing is neither of those things, not yet. But some of you are going to go quiet starting this week, on whatever it is you've been talking about instead of building. And a few years from now, you and I are going to cross paths again, and you're going to tell me about the year you finally stopped talking and started building, and how strange and how good it felt, the first time in years, to flex on something that was actually real. That's the whole message tonight, so don't let it slide past you the way you've let so many premature announcements slide past you before. Build in private. Flex in public. And never let the order get reversed again, because the order is the entire formula, and getting it backward is the quiet reason so many good ideas have died in conversation instead of living in a world. If tonight's message hit home, tell me in the comments what project you've been talking about instead of building. I read every single one of them, and I promise you're far from the only one carrying something you've announced more than you've actually done. And if you want more of this kind of straight talk on the habits that actually finish things instead of just talking about them, subscribe to Legacy Mindset, because this is exactly the work we do here every single week. Now go build in silence.